Great, well, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to have everybody here. This is a really popular program, and my name is Ellen Zoll-Goldman, and I'm from Career Design. I'm an associate director from Career Design, and I'm here with Megan Campan from Office of Global Services, and Leah will introduce everybody in a few minutes. So before we move on to introductions, I'd just like to mention how the session will be structured today. And you've seen the event description, so you'll see on our first and second slide that one of my colleagues will put also in the chat that this webinar will be recorded. And about a week from now, you'll see that, because it's a popular question, you will see the webinar recording on the OGS website. Towards the bottom of the front page. Just to give you that information ahead of time, because I know that's super popular. And so we're gonna do the presentation first with our featured attorneys, and then we will move to Q&A. I'm sure there are going to be lots more questions than we can answer in the chat. So definitely, or in the questions feature of the platform. So feel free to put your questions in the questions part, and then we will get to as many questions as we can. So I know it will be a wonderful and informative presentation today. I did want to mention a couple of folks who really helped us put this together. So Attorney Sandra Torres, Senior Counsel and Chief Advisor with the Office of General Counsel, and of course Megan Campan, who's Associate Director of the Office of Global Services, Leah Boccaccio, who's Assistant Director at the Office of Global Services, and everyone's on this webinar, Cassie Little, who's Program Manager at OGS as well, and of course our featured attorneys, Aaron Blumberg, Partner, Fragomen, Delray, Bernsen Loewy, LLP, and Attorney Sara Fleming as well, Senior Associate and an NU alum. So, so right now, just so our attorneys can have a sense for who's here, and I can also kind of let them know. Can you just put like how many of you are master's students or undergraduate students, and you can put it in the questions section if you would like, just so they have a sense of master's, undergraduate, doctoral. Great, so we have lots of master's, PhD, master's non-STEM, undergraduates. Yes, the webinar will be recording. So lots of masters, some post-OPT, and everything's still coming, a few PhDs. So we have kind of a good representation from all of those areas. And then how many of you are on F1 visas versus a J1 or something else? Can you put that in as well, just so we can see? Okay, let's see. Really F1, 1J1 on post-academic training. And I know we won't be able to see everybody, but keep them coming just to get a sense of it. Perfect, 1 H1B, but really mostly F1, maybe 1 or 2 academic training. And then finally, last thing you can help us out with is what campus locations are you all here from? Can you pop that in as well? 1H4, Boston, lots of Boston, Seattle, love it. Seattle, love the representation online. Seattle, Nahant, San Francisco, Portland, Maine. Great, so gives you a sense of the locations as well. So thank you for doing that, so that they will know a little bit about who you all are. And so, so without further ado, I think what I'm going to do first is do the introductions to our attorneys, and then we'll launch into the presentation, which will be a slide from OGS, one from Career Design, and then our attorneys. So attorney Aaron Blumberg is partner at Fragomen's Boston office, where he advises a diverse client base across the US, including investors and entrepreneurs, colleges and universities, students and other individuals, and multinational companies. So you can see everyone on US immigration law. He has a very deep immigration experience, I will say, advising all populations on all of the employment-based visas that we're going to be talking about today and more, everything from the H1B to national waivers. He also does some wonderful pro bono work. Aaron graduated from the University of Miami School of Law, magna cum laude at Emory for the bachelor's degree. And attorney Blumberg was a recipient of You Made a World of Difference Award in 2019 related to an International Education Association. He is a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the American Bar Association, the India-US Chamber of Commerce, and on the board of advisors of an organization called Interstride. His publications are way too numerous for me to cite here, but the topics range everything from international student entrepreneurs and recruiting global talent for employers to hot immigration topics, postdoc insights, and related to also athletes and influencers. So we're really fortunate to host Attorney Blumberg here today. I also am excited to introduce you to attorney Sara Fleming. She is senior associate at Fragomen and the Boston office, where she advises large multinational companies, has experience managing complex employment-based immigration cases for research institutions and biotech and pharmaceutical and technology. I think a lot of the areas that some of you are probably interested in, hospitals and universities and individuals. Sara's experience ranges from working with entrepreneurs to those interested in the arts. So wide, diverse experience with lots of different variety of immigration employment-based visas. So attorney Fleming is a Husky alumni from Northeastern University School of Law. And if any of you are from the School of Law, feel free to pop that into the question area. And she is a member of the Massachusetts Bar Association, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and the Massachusetts LGBTQ Bar Association. So attorneys Blumberg and Fleming, thank you so much for presenting today. And now I'm going to just turn it over to Megan. So she's going to talk a little bit about the support available for OGS. And so thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ellen. My name is Megan Campaign, and I'm happy to help bring this webinar to you today. As you know, the Office of Global Services, we are the international student office on campus, but we can only advise on F1 and J1 student visas. So I saw, most of you are F1 students, and we have a few Js out there. If you have any questions about how to maintain that student status, that you would come to us for. Also, if you wanted employment authorization, whether that's curricular practical training while you're still studying, or if you're applying for OPT or STEM after you graduate, we also offer support and cultural adjustment. We have cultural events that we put on throughout the year, and we also offer academic support services. I've included our office contact information. We recommend if you have any quick questions, dropping in to see us or giving us a call, you can also send us an email. And we are located in 354 Richards Hall. So we really hope you'll come to visit us at the Office of Global Services if you have questions about maintaining your status, but also for some of our fun events that we have going on throughout the year. We are in the middle of International Education Week, and so we've got a lot of fun programs coming up later this week as well. And I will pass it over to Ellen.
Great. So here we are, career design. And so I don't know if you know this, but you have free career design services for life. There are coaching labs we do, and I'll put the links to the chat. The Career Studio is a same day, no appointment needed drop in. You can come in person and you can see the hours. You can come virtually, and we video chat you via Teams, and we have evening hours until 7 o'clock for anything that's career related. So some of the things that we will help with are really kind of coaching you about how to frame your international student immigration status, employment options with employers. Not the immigration law piece, but just kind of how to bring it up, when to bring it up, what to say, making it sound easy and digestible to a prospective employer. Practice interviewing. These are all things that you can talk with us. Talent is a hiring event that we will be doing again in the spring. That's 2 weeks. And so there's lots of great resources that you can utilize with us, everything from Big Interview, which has AI running through it, to Localized, which has career fairs, virtual career fairs, and resources for those who are thinking about working overseas in the US. And we have some international specific programs like email etiquette, avoiding procrastination related to the job search, which nobody procrastinates, right? Everybody has those days. So just feel free to reach me, and I'll put my information in the chat if you want more information, or come into the Career Studio and I'll pop the link into the chat. And so hopefully this is really, really helpful. I hope you'll take advantage of our services. And so now I really am going to turn it over for the rest of our time together to our immigration attorneys, Attorney Blumberg and Attorney Fleming. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you, Northeastern, for having us here today. It is a pleasure to be presenting to you. As was mentioned, my name is Aaron Blumberg. I'm a partner in the Boston office. Fragomen is the largest and oldest immigration firm in the world. We exclusively practice immigration law, and really specifically business immigration, which is basically helping individuals like yourself get sponsored for work visas and permanent residence to be able to stay, live, and work in the US. And I'm joined by my colleague, Sara. Sara, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. Definitely happy to talk to all of you. I'm a senior associate, works with Aaron in the Boston office, and I am an alum of Northeastern Law, which is awesome. Also, shout out to whoever was there from the Root Institute, because I do live in Maine, and that's a very exciting development for all of us up there, and I'm sure for Northeastern as well. So we're very excited to talk to you guys today.
Excellent. Thank you, Sara. So we're ready to begin. I do want to apologize. We're having some technical issues, so you can't see our face, although you can see it there on the screen, but you can't see it live. And our friends at Northeastern are going to be helping us with the slides today. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to be discussing. Given the time, I want to jump right into the presentation so we can leave some time for questions later. So let's get started. And really today, what we're going to be focusing on are your options after you graduate. So where I'm going to take over is pretty much after your F1 advisor's role ends, which is when OPT ends. And so our presentation today is going to really talk about what your options are after you graduate. I do want to let everyone know that this is really just general immigration advice. Everyone's situation is unique and distinct. So I just want you to keep that in mind. We're going to provide some very, overview information of different options, but we definitely recommend that if you want more personalized attention, given that each case is specific, you probably want to reach out to an immigration attorney on your own. Okay, so the first concept, and actually if we can move it up to slide 9, I always like to start by explaining the difference between immigrants and non-immigrants. And so immigrants are individuals that are coming to the United States permanently, also or better known as permanent residents or green card holders. So if an immigrant is coming to the US permanently, that means that a non-immigrant is not coming to the US permanently. They're coming temporarily. And so immigrant is really a green card holder, and non-immigrant is somebody on a temporary visa, whether it's a temporary student visa or a temporary work visa. So it's really important to understand these two concepts, and that's in fact how we break up the presentation. After I go over some overview and general immigration info, we're gonna delve into non-immigrant visas, AKA temporary visas, and then we're gonna talk about immigrant visas, AKA green cards or permanent residence. All right, so the next slide, government agencies. So when you go through the immigration process, fortunately or unfortunately, however you look at it, you're going to have to deal with US bureaucracy and government agencies. So I put up on the screen some of the more common government agencies that you're going to be working with. First is DHS, Department of Homeland Security. And within DHS, there is USCIS, ICE, and CBP. And within ICE, there's also CBP. So USCIS is the government entity that processes all of the requests for immigration benefits. And what I mean by that is when you apply for OPT, when you apply for an H1B, when you apply for a green card, those applications are reviewed and processed and hopefully approved by USCIS. ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and ICE's job is to make sure that individuals that are in the United States are supposed to be in the United States and that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But ICE also oversees SEVP, which is the Student and Exchange Visitor Program, which is what a lot of you are here on today, either an F, M, or J visa. And the final part of DHS I want to talk about is CBP, Customs and Border Protection. Those are the friendly officers we all love to see when we get off that 15-hour flight and we're tired and we're cranky and you have an officer asking you questions. That is CBP. So they make sure that you are allowed and authorized to enter the United States. Next up is the Department of Labor, DOL. We're going to talk about them a little bit more later on. Their role really comes into play on H1Bs and certain green cards, and the Labor Department generally wants to make sure that your employment in the US does not disrupt the wages or working conditions of US workers. And we'll talk in a little bit more practically about what that means. And then finally, the State Department, they run all the embassies and consulates. So when you're back home and you need to go get that visa at the embassy or the consulate, that is the US Department of State. All right, so the next slide, the legal structure of immigration. So there's really 3 points I want to make on this slide. One, immigration law comes from many different places. As a result, it can be a bit confusing. There is no one immigration law book or treaties or regulation that covers everything. There's a lot of different sources that comprise immigration law. As a result, immigration law is often inconsistent and it is always changing. Two concepts that I think are difficult for people like yourself that are here in the country on a student or exchange visitor visa. In terms of inconsistencies, you know, there are some things in immigration that are black and white, and there's other things that are kind of gray areas. And as a result, you kind of see different things happen, different adjudications, different trends. I'll give you an example. You could see two people with very similar, almost identical backgrounds apply for something on the same day and get approved on different days. Or one gets approved and one gets a request for additional evidence, or one gets approved and one gets denied. Unfortunately, there are some inconsistencies, and there's also a fair amount of subjectivity that officers have when adjudicating cases. And then the always changing part, to be honest, it's been a pretty quiet year, 2022. But in the past, especially a few years ago, we were seeing changes on almost a daily basis of things that would change. Let's move on to the next section where we're going to review some of the more common immigration documents. And we're going to start with the visa stamp, which I consider to be probably the most confusing document. So you can see Dan Handsome, a nice dog up on the screen. He is on an F1 visa at Yale University, so he's a very intelligent dog. And so the document that you see up there on the screen, that visa, what I want you to understand is that this is a travel permit. This document, and by the way, can you, I don't think, if you can move to the next slide. So this is a travel document. And so a lot of people incorrectly think that this is a status document. And I'm going to explain what this means. So when you're here in the United States and you open your passport and you see this visa stamp, first of all, hopefully it's a picture of yourself and not a picture of your dog. But assuming it is, what I want you to know is it really doesn't mean much, if anything at all, when you're in the United States. If it's expired, don't worry about it. If it has a different status on it, don't worry about it. When you may want to worry about it is when your parents say, it's been a while, you know, we haven't seen you, we want you to come home for the holidays. Well, that's when this comes into play, because this is a travel permit. And this is what you need to enter the country from outside the US. But once you're already in the US, this document doesn't really mean much. So don't worry too much about it. You want to worry about the next document on the next slide, which is the I-94. The I-94 is the most important document that you will have when you are physically in the US on US soil. The I-94 tells not only you, but it tells the government, it tells your employer, it tells the driver's license bureau what your status is and when your status expires. And so up on the screen, you can see Lydia Lee entered the country in 2012, was admitted as a B1, and there's an expiration date. So it's really critical that every time you travel abroad and re-enter the country, you want to go to that website on the screen, you want to pull your I-94, and you want to make sure that everything's accurate. And when I say accurate, for you, it should say that your status is F1 or J1, whatever it may be. And then it will probably say that your status expires D/S. That means duration of status. And really what that means is we need to look a little further than the I-94. We need to also look at your I-20 or your DS-2019 to really see when your program, whatever it may be, finishes, when that completes. Now, later on in life, if you get sponsored for like a work visa, you will get an I-94 that does have an actual expiration date. And you need to make sure that before that expiration date comes, you take some action, whether that's departing the country, changing your status, extending your status, but doing something. And the other thing is, if you travel and you pull this and you see that there's a mistake, if you're on an F or a J, you want to reach out to your F or J advisor. If you're on a work visa, you want to reach out to your employer or your attorney. It's your responsibility to get this corrected. If CBP makes a mistake and it's clear that it was their mistake and not yours, but you don't notice the mistake, you are the one, unfortunately, that's going to suffer the consequences. So this is your responsibility, your obligation as an individual in the United States to check and confirm that it's correct. The next slide is also an I-94, but this is how I-94s used to look. And basically it was a handwritten document or a little card. Thankfully, they moved to electronic about 10 years ago. but you still see these sometimes. So I put this up on the screen so you're familiar with it, especially when you're crossing land borders, you sometimes still get these. The next slide is an I-20. I don't think I need to explain that. And the slide after that is a DS 2019. I think we're familiar with that. And so we'll go to the last image, which is an approval notice. This is an I-797 notice of action. So when you apply or your employer applies on your behalf for a work visa and it gets approved, you will get a document that looks like this. It's called an approval notice. And if you see the arrows in the top right, it says class H1B, it says approval notice, and it has validity dates. And then on the bottom, even more important, if you see the arrow on the bottom, there's a new I-94. So the I-94 comes in 3 different forms. It can be the electronic one you pull from the CBP website. It can be the handwritten card that we don't really see too often. And it can be on the bottom of an approval notice. So what happens is that when you change your status, for example, maybe you go from OPT to H1B, when that H1B gets approved, you'll get this approval notice. And at the bottom will be a new I-94. And again, that I-94 will tell you, will tell the government, will tell your employers what your status is and when your status expires. And just like I pointed out in the other I-94, you want to make sure that you take some action before that expiration date is reached. All right, so that covers the basics. And now let's move into non-immigrant visas. So we can go to the next slide. Non-immigrant visas, like I mentioned, these are people coming to the United States temporarily. So most of the people watching or listening today are on non-immigrant visas. Now, one concept that's really important to know is dual intent. And so as you can see on the screen, there's 2 visas that qualify for dual intent, H and L. And these are really, really important because a dual intent visa allows you to have the intent to stay in the United States temporarily, but also to have the second or dual intent to obtain permanent residence. This is different from an F or a J visa, which are single intent visas, where you can only have the intent to be in the US temporarily. So quick example, let's say you're back home in your home country, you're applying for a visa, it's an H1B, and the officer says, what are your plans after your H1B finishes? And you say to the officer, oh, I plan to get a green card and then become a citizen and spend the rest of my life in the United States. I'm never coming back here. What will the officer say? The officer will probably say, great, good luck, visa approved, hope to never see you again. But if you're on an F or a J visa and the officer says, what are you going to do after you graduate? And you say, I'm going to get a green card, whew, you will definitely have your visa denied because it's a single intent visa and you cannot have the intent to stay permanently. All right, so next slide is what I call the alphabet soup of visas. So these are all the different visas that are out there. You can see that there's a lot, and actually I think you're 1 slide behind. If we can move up 1 slide to the alphabet soup. You can see that there's a lot of different visas up here. When it comes down to it though, I put in bold really the only ones that I think people in this audience would be interested in, and even more so when it comes down to it, most of you are probably only going to qualify for 1 visa if you want to stay and work in the US, and that's going to be the H1B. So let's start with the next slide by talking about the H1B. The H1B is probably the most important visa out there. I'm sure it's one that a lot of you have already heard of. What's great about it is that it's not country specific, which some of the other visas are that we'll show you in a few minutes. So it doesn't matter where you're from or what your nationality is. In order to get an H1B, you need an employer to sponsor you to work in a specialty occupation, which is a job that requires at least a bachelor's degree or higher in a specific field of study. And so this right here is the #1 reason why H1Bs get denied is because the government does not believe that a bachelor's in a specific field of study is required in order to perform the role. Some examples. So, for example, a nurse is almost impossible to get approved for an H1B because generally in the US, a nurse only needs an associate's degree. That's one example. On the flip side, if you have something like an engineer, a professor, a postdoc, an attorney, things like that, I mean, those are very, very clear that they require a bachelor's, and in fact, probably well more than a bachelor's. In those cases, generally, you don't have that issue. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't honestly matter as much what degree you have. It's more about the position. So if you have a doctorate, but you're applying to be a lab assistant, and that lab assistant only requires 2 years of experience and no degree, it doesn't matter that you have a PhD, the position doesn't qualify. So keep that in mind. Now, H1B, if you get it approved, it's valid for up to 3 years at a time for a maximum of 6 years, although there are exceptions, which I'll get to later, where you can extend beyond that 6-year maximum. The biggest issue with the H1Bs right now is that there's just not enough to go around. So there's a cap or a limit of 85,000 new H1Bs that the government issues each year. And this is just not even close to enough. And I'll show you in a second on the next slide what the numbers look like, but it's not good because there's a lot of demand in the United States for people to be working here on H1Bs. So before we get into that, there's two types of employers when it comes to H1B that you need to be aware of. Some employers are subject to this cap, meaning subject to the 85,000 total, and some employers are exempt. So the exempt employers are nonprofit colleges and universities like Northeastern, nonprofit organizations affiliated with colleges and universities, and nonprofit research and government research organizations. So if you were to get a job offer at one of those employers, it doesn't matter what you're doing, again, as long as it qualifies for an H1B. But what I mean is you don't have to be a professor, you don't have to be a postdoc, you don't have to be a scientist. You could be the director of finance for Northeastern and that would qualify. But if you get an offer from one of these employers, what's great is you don't have to worry about the 85,000 limit. All the universities in the US, they can sponsor as many H1Bs as they want. Meanwhile, Amazon and Facebook and TCS and Infosys and Cognizant and all those big companies have to share 85,000. So if we can go to the next slide, if you look in the middle, it tells us how many applications we received over the last 5 years. And in 2022, there was 484,000 applications for 85,000 H1Bs. That means, I'm not a mathematician, but that means that 399,000 people that were probably qualified, that had good job offers, did not get an H1B. So let's talk logistically about how it works. Every March is what we call H1B registration season or lottery season. Usually around the first 2 to 3 weeks of March, every employer in the United States is given the opportunity to register their employees for an H1B. It's a pretty simple, quick process. They register them, and then on March 31st or April 1st, the government holds a random lottery, and they select 85,000. And if you get selected, it doesn't mean that you get an H1B. It means that you are given the opportunity to then formally apply for an H1B within the next 90 days. If you didn't win the lottery, cross your fingers and hope there's a second lottery, which some years there is. If not, unfortunately, you're basically back to the drawing board. But we're going to talk in a few minutes about what those options are if you don't get an H1B. The only advantage you can get is if you have a US earned advanced degree, meaning a master's or a doctorate. You get a slight advantage in the lottery. It's not significant, especially because so many people have master's degrees these days that it's not as distinguishing as it used to be, but it still definitely helps. Other than that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD. It doesn't matter if you're getting a job offer to replace Jeff Bezos as the CEO of Amazon. It doesn't matter. There is no preference. It is completely random. The only thing is that advanced degree helps you slightly. So the final thing about the logistics is that if you win the lottery, you find out in April, you then have 90 days to file the case. And then if it's approved, the H1B does not take effect until October 1. So keep that in mind. October 1 is when the H1B would start. Now, let's go to the next slide. So I mentioned before that if you get an H1B, it's valid for up to 6 years. So you can change employers, but keep in mind that that 6-year total applies, meaning if you work for Facebook for 4 years and then you want to switch to work for Google, you're only going to have 2 years remaining of your 6-year allotment. Let's look at quickly these 4 change of employer scenarios. So if you're going from a cap subject to a cap subject employer, like I just mentioned, from Facebook to Google, no problem. You won the lottery with Facebook, and that means that your H1B now is transferable to another company like Google. Second example is cap subject to cap exempt. So let's say you win the lottery with Facebook, and then you want to move to work at Northeastern, no problem because you won the lottery, but it doesn't even matter because Northeastern is exempt. The third example is cap exempt to cap exempt. So you go from Northeastern to Boston University, no issue there. The last one is the problematic one. If you're on an H1B with Northeastern, which means you did not win the lottery because you didn't have to enter the lottery, and you now want to change to work at Facebook, that's where it's problematic because you then would have to have Facebook enter you in the lottery, win the lottery, get the H1B approved, and then the earliest you could start working for them would be the following October 1st. So that's a tricky one. The last thing is concurrent employment. So this is kind of a little workaround. You could be sponsored by a cap exempt employer like Northeastern, and then get a second or dual H1B with a cap subject employer like Facebook, as long as you maintain that cap exempt Northeastern employment. So you can't do this, and then once you get the Facebook approval, quit your job at Northeastern, because if you do that, then both H1Bs would be invalidated. But this is a potential solution for some people. I think for most people, working one job is enough, and 2 can be a little overkill. All right, next slide. Just some basics on an H1B. You cannot file an H1B for yourself. There must be an employer-employee relationship, and the employer files it on your behalf. You can only work for the employer that sponsored you, and you can only work in the position that they sponsored you for. So if you get a promotion or some type of job change, your employer is required to file an amendment with immigration before that promotion can happen. And beware, because immigration does do random site visits, and if they stop by and your H1B says that you're doing job A and you're really in job B, you will have issues. So be careful with that. If you lose your job, you have a grace period of up to 60 days. So that can help, especially we're seeing, I think everyone in the news, lots of layoffs over the last few weeks, unfortunately. So those people, if they're on an H1B, have a grace period of up to 60 days, not to exceed the date that their H1B was set to expire. All right, next slide. In terms of international travel, It's similar to what you do on your F or J in the sense that you need to apply for that travel visa or visa stamp. Remember the picture with Dan Handsome, the dog? You need to apply for that at the embassy. Once you get that, you can enter. Once you enter, that visa stamp really does not have any bearing on your status. And then the fees. So important for you all to know, by law, the employer has to pay the government fees and the legal fees, also known as attorney fees. So you can see some of those up on the screen. Next slide is wage requirements. So in order to be sponsored for an H1B, you must be paid the higher of the prevailing wage or the actual wage. The actual wage is pretty easy. The actual wage is what the company normally pays to people in your position with your background or experience. The prevailing wage is what the Department of Labor, remember we talked about them in the beginning, this is what the Department of Labor says is the minimum salary for your specific position in your specific location. And sometimes this is problematic, especially for startups and small companies. I often see that a lot of startups will try to pay you a lower base salary and compensate with big stock options. And unfortunately, that often just is not going to fly for an H1B. So keep that in mind. For big companies, established companies, usually, thankfully, don't see too many issues with the prevailing wage. All right, the next slide is the cap gap extension. I mentioned earlier that if you get an H1B approved for a cap subject employer, it will start on October 1st. Okay, so if it starts on October 1st, what sometimes you have an issue in that your OPT may expire well before then. And so I'm going to give you two hypotheticals. The first one is, let's say you graduate in May and your OPT goes from June until June. Well, your OPT expires in June, and in this hypothetical, you won the H1B lottery and you have an H1B that's set to start on October 1st. Well, in that case, your OPT ends in June, H1B starts October. In the past, you would have to leave the country after your grace period ends and return on October 1st. Now, with this cap gap extension, as long as your employer files for the H1B before your OPT expires, your OPT gets automatically extended until September 30th. Where this sometimes is not beneficial is for people that graduate in the winter. If you graduate in December and maybe have OPT that starts in January and ends in January, then you may not be able to benefit from this. All right, if everyone wouldn't mind putting your phone or computer on mute, I'm getting a lot of background noise right now. Thank you. And we can move on to the next slide. And the last slide on H1Bs, just to summarize everything we spoke about, this is what you need to get an H1B. First, find a job that's willing to sponsor you, that's willing to pay the fees, pay you above, at or above the prevailing wage, enter the lottery in March, win the lottery, and get the H1B approved. To be honest, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 are not that difficult. It's within your control. Number 5 is the tough one. That's the one that really frustrates me. It frustrates my clients. Again, it's a lottery. It's not based on merit. It's not based on who you are, or how good you are. So that's where things sometimes get derailed, and it's really difficult to deal with that. So I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Sara, and she's going to talk to you about what happens if you can't get an H1B and what your other options are. So we can move to the next slide, and Sara is going to walk us through that.
Thanks, Aaron, and hi, everybody. So like Aaron said, what happens if you can't get an H1B? And it's very possible that your first time in the lottery or your only time in the lottery, you're not going to be successful just based on the ratio and the difference between the people who want an H1B and the number that the government will actually give each year. So don't panic. There's definitely multiple options that people can take advantage of, really depending on someone's education, their background, and their nationality. If you're someone who is on an OPT and can take advantage of sort of a 3-year STEM extension of that OPT, you potentially have 3 chances to get into the H1B lottery. So, trying to work on your OPT for as long as possible is definitely a good place to start. You can also consider going back to school to obtain an advanced degree, because that should get you another round of OPT afterwards and maybe get you one more chance or multiple chances at that H1B again. And then there are also some more of our exciting alphabet soup visas that we talked about earlier that potentially may apply to you in different situations. And I'll go through those kind of quickly right now. If we can move to the next slide. So we have the L1, which is the next slide. And the L1 is it's a dual intent visa, similar to the H1B, except that there's a requirement that you have to have worked for a company for 1 year abroad that has a subsidiary in the US, or vice versa. So this may apply to you if you're someone who is on an OPT, you're working for a big company, and they say, hey, you didn't make it into the lottery, but we actually have a job that could work for you in our office in Singapore. And if you go to that office in Singapore and you work there for 1 year, there's a chance that you would be able to use that experience with that company's affiliate to come back to the US in an L1. The L1 duration, if it's an L1A, which is an executive position, which is definitely people who have usually more experience and kind of further along in their career, 7 years. And if you're an L1B, which is what most people get, which is for someone with specialized knowledge, then that's for 5 years. So definitely could apply to you if you are in a situation where an employer has a position for you abroad and you can use that experience to come back again. Next slide. So this is these are our traders and treaty investors. And, this one has a little bit of a high bar just in terms of the requirement that there is an investment that someone has to provide in terms of, they're starting a business in the US and they are, they're investing a substantial amount of capital in the country. So for someone who is, maybe just graduating or, maybe, a student, this is a little bit of a high bar, but this is kind of the closest we have right now to an entrepreneur visa. So it's definitely something to look at if, you think you have some funding coming in your future, or, you are starting a business, and that you are someone who is from one of the treaty countries. So it's only between certain countries and the United States. If we can move to the next slide. So countries that are missing are pretty big ones. We've got India, China, Russia, and Brazil don't qualify for either the E1 or the E2. So, if you're someone who has dual citizenship and one of your countries does qualify, then you can use that. But if you're from one of those countries that don't qualify, and there are many others too. You can see on the next slide that we have the list of all the treaty countries. So, for someone who's an entrepreneur, someone who has funding that's potentially coming to them, I think, the e-visas are definitely something to look at, but the investment part of it can be a little bit of a high bar for someone, who is maybe just graduating. And can we move the slide up to, you can put it on the treaty countries for a second. There you go. So, you can take a look here. Some countries have both, and some countries only have one. And, there are a lot of countries clearly that are not on here. And if we move to the next slide, so there's also an O1 option. And the O1 is really interesting. It's for people who have extraordinary ability in the sciences, arts, education, business, or athletics. And I think a lot of people see extraordinary ability and they get a little scared because that sounds like you have to be, you have to have a gold medal or a Nobel Peace Prize or, a Nobel in chemistry in order to qualify for this. But that's really not the case. We, in practice, see a lot of these get approved, particularly for people with PhDs, people who are in STEM fields, people who have a record of publications in their field, someone who has a very strong business background. You know, these are very successful, and the Immigration Service did put out some guidance earlier this year that kind of made it a little better for people with STEM degrees and STEM PhDs to get an O. So it's definitely worth looking at if you're someone who potentially can fall into to this category if you have a background like this. They are employer specific, but you can have multiple O's. So you can have, you know, if you had 4 employers that wanted to sponsor you, you can have 4 O's. And the exception to that is someone who is an artist or a musician, or someone who kind of would find their jobs or the things that they are doing through an agent. And with that, you can have an agent be your sponsor. So that's kind of a carve out for people who are artists. An interesting thing about the O is that anyone who is subject to the J1 2-year home residency requirement can obtain an O visa. So it blocks the 2-year home residency requirement, definitely blocks a lot of other pathways for people, but not the O. So if we can move to the next slide, this is just sort of the criteria for the O1. You know, if you're someone who's interested in O1, obviously we would send all this information to you. I won't go through all of them now, but there are different categories where you have to show that you have experience or you have something in your education or your background meets these different categories. So in our next slide, it talks about the H1B one. It's for people from Chile or Singapore only. So if any of you are out there, this is for you. It's very similar to an H1B. You have to have an offer of a job in a specialty occupation, but there's no dual intent like there is for a regular H1B. So this is not one where you'd be at the consulate saying, yeah, I'm going to live in the United States for my entire life. Not one you'd want to do for that. There are caps like the regular H1B for the H1B one, but we almost never meet them. So we kind of think that there's not really a cap on them because they're almost never reached. And for our next slide, if we have any Aussies out there, there is the E3, that's for you. Also very similar to the H1B because you need a specialty occupation job. It's valid for 2 years, renewable indefinitely, you know, very good option for Australians if anybody out there could take advantage of this. And our next slide is for our neighbors to the north and south. So this is the TN for Canadians and Mexicans. You have to be a national of either country. You have to be coming to the US to work in a profession that's listed on the NAFTA schedule that's actually in the regulations for this, for NAFTA. And generally requires a bachelor's degree. Usually is a great option for people because you have it for 3-year increments. You can renew it forever essentially, but the positions are very limited to the occupations that are actually in the regulations for the TN. So if we can put the next slide up for those, just so everybody can see what they are, they're kind of random. So, you know, there's some things on here that are a little interesting, like silviculturist. I think that has something to do with forestry. So, you know, you may very well fit into one of these categories. And if you're a national of Canada or Mexico, that's fantastic, as this is a great option for you. You know, as long as you can show that you're going to be in one of these positions and that you have that degree, you know, you're pretty much good to go on these. So, you know, if you fit into these and you're from one of those countries, it definitely could be a good option for you to look at. So those are kind of our alphabet soup options for people who don't make it into the H1B lottery, you know, in their first try or their only try. And, you know, depending on your background or where you're from, one of these very much could fit you and kind of be your pathway forward for a non-immigrant visa. And now I'm going to pass back to Aaron because he was going to talk more about sort of our green card interview and, you know, what happens, you know, after your non-immigrant visa.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. All right, so we can go to the next slide. And again, immigrants means green card holder. It means permanent resident. They're all synonymous. And if anyone wants to guess why it's known as the green card, I like to do this when it's a live audience, but it isn't. So if you haven't figured it out, it was originally a green card, and that's why it was called a green card. Great story. So you can see it is actually green in the picture there. It's gone through some different variations, but what matters most is that this allows you to live and work in the United States for the rest of your life. So let's go to the next slide and talk about green card basics. So these, I think, are just incredibly important points. And also some of these are things that there's a lot of confusion about. So the first point, although it is strongly, strongly recommended, you do not have to be on an H1B or an L to file for a green card. Yes, the H1B and L are the only two dual intent visas. And yes, that is the best case scenario. And that's what we always want. But you can't always get an H, as you saw. And so we're getting more creative, and we're having a lot of clients that are jumping directly from F to green card, J to green card, TN to green card. It's a little trickier. It doesn't work for everyone, but it's something that we're always going to look into for our clients. The next point, being in the US for a certain number of years is not going to help you. So I have clients that literally, I have one recently that has never even been to the United States, not even for vacation, but he is extremely well accomplished, and we got him his green card approved quickly and relatively easily. And I have other people that are here in the US for 20 years, they get their bachelor's, their master's, their PhD, and they work, and for some reason, maybe they can't get a green card. So that is just not a factor. The next point is that you can have multiple green card applications pending at the same time. So maybe, and you'll see in a few minutes why this makes sense, because processing times vary across categories and fluctuate. So maybe you have a family member that sponsors you, and that's pending for years and years, and then your employer sponsors you. Well, that's not a problem. You can have multiple applications pending at the same time, and whichever gets approved first, that's it. The rest would then be essentially, no good anymore and voided. The next point, not very common, but you could be sponsored by an employer that you don't currently work for, because the green card process is all based on future employment. So an employer could sponsor you saying that we're sponsoring this person so that upon receipt of their green card, they can work for us. In reality, most of the times, only your current employer is going to want to put out the time, the money, and effort to sponsor you. And so 99% of the time, that's what we see. Green cards are based on your country of birth, not citizenship. And this is really important for people from two countries, specifically India and China. So if you were born in India, but then when you were a small child, your parents immigrated to Canada, and you're a Canadian citizen, and you're not an Indian citizen, and you spent your whole life in Canada, unfortunately, for green card purposes, you're counted under India's quota and not Canada. And you'll see in a few minutes what the impact is of that. And then finally, whenever we talk about green cards, it's just assumed that your spouse and your unmarried children under 21 will be included, so you all file together. All right, the next slide. These are the 4 different ways to get a green card: blood, sweat, tears, and luck. So blood is through family, sweat is through employment, tears are through asylum, and luck is through the diversity lottery. So let's go to the next slide and talk about the diversity lottery. If I was there in person, I would ask you to raise your hand if you entered the lottery last month, but I'm sure quite a few of you did. And if you didn't and you're eligible, do it next year because you have nothing to lose. So basically, the government holds a lottery every year where they give out about 50,000 green cards. Your odds of winning are not good, but they're so much better than winning the Powerball. But $2 million versus a green card, I don't know which one I would prefer, but it's not as bad as the Powerball. People do win. There's about 15 million applicants for about 50,000 green cards. Who is not eligible? People born, and again, it's all based on where you were born. People born in those countries that you see in the middle of the screen are not eligible. This list changes every year, and it's based on how many people are immigrating from certain countries, because this is the diversity lottery. And so only people from countries that are less well represented in the US are going to be eligible. All right, next is family. So you can be sponsored by a family member. We can go to the next, there we go. There's two ways, and by the way, this is my own language. I call it the quick process and the slow process. The quick process is when you're sponsored by an immediate relative. An immediate relative could be your spouse, it could be a minor child who's unmarried, or it could be a parent. So if you're a US citizen, you can sponsor your parent. That's the quick process. For those immediate family members, it usually takes about a year to get a green card. The slow process is these other groups. You see those 4 groups of people. It's actually 5 because the second bullet is divided into 2. But those are the other family members that can sponsor you. What this means is you can't be sponsored by aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, next door neighbors, best friends. That's it. That is the full list. But let's go to the next slide. And this tells us how long it takes in those categories. So what you see up on the screen is called the Visa Bulletin. And this comes out every month, and it's published by the Department of State. And there's one for family and there's one for employment that we'll show you in a minute. And it tells you how long approximately does it take to get a green card. So let me teach you quickly how to read this. If we look at the left-hand column, it says, well, it says employment-based, and that's a mistake. It should say family-based. But where it says that, pretend that says family-based, you can see below F1, F2, F2, F3, F4. Not to be confused, and immigration loves to confuse us, this F1 does not mean F1 student, it means family first preference. So family first preference would be an unmarried son or daughter of a US citizen who's over 21. So that could be somebody in the audience. If you're 23 years old, you're not married, and your parent is a US citizen and they sponsor you, well then you would go under F1, and then you find what country you were born in. Were you born in the Philippines, Mexico, India, China, or were you born in another country? Well, that second column, all chargeability areas except those listed, that would be for every other country. So Canada, Iran, Ireland, Pakistan, Afghanistan, South Africa, wherever it may be, that would be in that column. So you see there some dates. So let's just pretend that you were born in Mexico. You see November 15th, 2000. That means that if your parent sponsored you on or before November 15th, 2000, you would be eligible to get your green card now today, 22 years later. So it can be slow. If you look at the chart, look at F3 and go across to Mexico. F3 is married sons and daughters of citizens. They're working on cases from 1997. That is pretty old. There's probably a number of people that were not even born in 1997. And in fact, maybe most of you were not even born in 1997. So that's how you read it. If you look at F2A, there's the letter C. That means current. That means there is no backlog. F2A is for spouses of green card holders. All right, with that, I will turn it over again to Sara, and we can move to the next slide. She is going to walk us through employment-based green cards.
Thanks, Aaron. So in addition to those family-based categories that Aaron just walked everybody through, we also have employment-based categories. And these are extremely important if you are someone who is eventually going to be getting your green card through your employer or your work in the US. So there are 5 different categories, but we really only need to deal with the first 3. So let's go to the next slide. So EB3, jobs that require a bachelor's degree. You're always going to need an employer to sponsor you. EB2, jobs that require an advanced degree or a bachelor's degree plus 5 years of experience, always need employer sponsorship except for a national interest waiver, and I'll get to that one in a minute. EB1, priority workers, no labor certification needed. you do, for someone who's a person of extraordinary ability, which is similar to that O1 non-immigrant category that I spoke about earlier, you don't need an employer sponsorship. Basically, the government thinks you're so incredible if you're getting an EB1 that you don't need an employer to sponsor you, and they will just hand you a green card. For outstanding professors and researchers, you do need employer sponsorship. And for multinational executives and managers, you also need employer sponsorship. So if we can move to the next slide, I'll show you what it looks like in terms of the timing for employment cases. So if you're one of those special EB1 people, you have C's all the way across the board, which means that your priority date is current, which means you can file your EB1 case and also file your green card case at the same time. And it's likely that you will be able to get your green card in a matter of a year or so. For the EB2 preference category, you can see that some places are current, and you can see that if you are someone who was born in China or India, you have a backlog, and you also have a backlog for EB3. This is definitely a significant issue for our friends who are born in India and China. It's something that people really think about all the time, because these numbers really move in a way that is not linear. So it's not like every month we move forward another day, or we move forward another month. It really depends on how many cases are filed in all of these categories. And so, every month we're looking at the visa bulletin that is put out by the Department of State to see where are we. And so things move rapidly forwards and backwards all of the time, and it really can impact people's careers and life in the United States. So it's definitely an important concept to understand. So if we can move to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about EB1 extraordinary ability and outstanding professors and researchers. So this is for someone who really can demonstrate the international recognition of their achievements in a particular academic field. And I know I said earlier about the O1s, which is very similar to this, being manageable for a lot of people, being something that is attainable for a lot of people, even people with PhDs and a little bit of experience in their field. The EB1s, especially, I'd say in the last 5 or 6 years, have been much more difficult to obtain for people, especially the EB1A, which is the one that you can file by yourself without an employer sponsorship. So this is one where you really want to make sure you meet these criteria in a significant way. Definitely one where I suggest really reaching out to Immigration Counsel to give you an idea if you really do kind of meet this category, because it really is a very helpful for you in your immigration if you do meet this category and can be successful with an EB1, because as we just saw on the last slide, it's current for everybody. So you really kind of skip the line, as it were, if you are able to have a successful EB1 case. So next slide will tell us a little bit about, again, extraordinary ability. This is the one that you don't need an employer sponsorship. You can call this self-petition. And this is the one that is really the most difficult of all of them. So with outstanding researcher or professor, you need to meet 2 of the criteria. With EB1, you have to meet 3. Doesn't sound like a lot more, but the USCIS really adjudicates it in a very kind of strict manner. The next slide will talk to us about multinational manager. Also one where you kind of have to have the eligibility criteria really locked down. You need to have that 1 year of employment for a company working outside the US. And you have to have been in a managerial or executive capacity. So this one might not be necessarily available for anyone right now in their career, but potentially could be down the road. And the next slide is where we talk a little bit about labor certification or PERM. So this is the process that we do with the Department of Labor, not with USCIS. And the whole idea behind this PERM process, this labor certification process, is that the employer has to prove that they were unable to find any minimally qualified US applicants who are ready, willing, and able to fill the position that is open. So the position that you are in, or the position that you are going to be in for this company, they have to go through this process with the Department of Labor to show that there's no US workers who have the basic qualifications for the job who could do the job. So the attorneys work with the employer to establish these minimum requirements, and then we have to get a prevailing wage from the Department of Labor, which basically we send them all the criteria, and they come back and say, okay, for this position, this job occupation category, this geographic area, this is the wage that needs to be paid to someone in this position. This is the lowest wage that could be paid to someone. And then the employer has to go through a series of advertisements, recruitment for the position. There's a bunch of required recruitment places that the Department of Labor mandates. There's a specific timeline that you have to go through. And if there are any qualified US applicants for the jobs, they have to be vetted by the employer, and that can stop the labor certification process if they do find a qualified US worker. If there's no qualified US workers, if you finish all the recruitment and you can move forward from there, you submit the perm application to the Department of Labor, and then the Department of Labor certifies it, hopefully, and then you move on to the next part of the process. So the next slide will give you a little bit more about what happens next. So the perm is really your first step for most people for employment-based permanent residence. And step 2 is the I-140 form, which is filed by the employer with the USCIS. Basically, the employer is confirming the sponsorship of you and the offer of this permanent position to you, demonstrates its ability to pay the prevailing wage. And then we also have to prove at the I-140 stage that the employee meets all of the criteria that was in that perm. So if we're saying in that perm that the job requires a bachelor's degree in a STEM field and 5 years of experience plus skills X, Y, and Z, then at the I-140 stage, we have to prove that the employee has the bachelor's degree, has the years of experience, and has skills in X, Y, and Z. So it's very important to kind of match that perm and that I-140 together, because we need to be able to prove everything that we said on the perm is still true at the I-140 stage. Now, step 3 is where you actually get to file your adjustment of status application, which is your green card application, essentially. So that part is filed by the foreign national and any immediate family members. Sometimes it can be filed at the same time as the I-140, which cuts down a little bit on time, but it's basically it's based on your background. So while the I-140 is based on the employer and whether there's a job open for you and whether you meet the criteria that was on that perm, the I-45, the adjustment of status application, is really about you. It's really about your background. It's about, you have to document your personal, medical, criminal, and immigration history. You have to prove that you will not become a public charge to the US in the future. So it's really about sort of your biographical information at that point. Now, this adjustment of status application can only be filed when your priority date is current. So that's where we go back to that visa bulletin that we were looking at, where, if you have that C there, you're all set and you can go forward and you can file your adjustment of status application and your I-140. But if your priority date is not current, then you basically are holding at step 2, and you have to wait until you are current to file step 3. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk about kind of a little bit of an interesting one in EB2. So like I said, for EB2, it's for advanced degrees or bachelor's plus 5 years of experience, and you always need an employer sponsorship, but not for the National Interest Waiver. And the National Interest Waiver is for people who are requesting that labor certification, that perm process, is waived, because whatever they are going to be doing in the US is in the interests of the US. So that their proposed endeavor, whatever it is, it could be research, it could be, you could be opening a company, it could be a whole variety of things, and it's fairly broad actually, that your proposed endeavor in the US has substantial merit and national importance, and that you, the person who is applying, who is self-petitioning, is the person who is well positioned to advance this proposed endeavor. It is a good category for STEM PhDs. I have definitely used it for people who are entrepreneurs before. I would say one of the advantages of EB2 is that, versus EB1 is where EB1 you have all of these delineated categories. You have to show the evidence in all of these different categories. The EB2 is a little bit broader for National Interest Waiver. So you can kind of make creative arguments with the National Interest Waiver that I don't think you can with an EB1. So it's definitely something that is worth thinking about if you're someone who, is working in a particularly interesting field, you have research out there and you kind of want to go on your own, or you need to go on your own for whatever reason if you have an employer who's not going to sponsor you. I think the National Interest Waiver is definitely an interesting option to look into. And that is the end of our EB options. So I think we're back to you, Aaron.
Yes, we are. Thank you, Sarah. All right, we can move to the next slide. We're almost finished, and then we will take questions. So I just want to finish up with some general advice moving forward. First thing, please keep copies of everything. I don't think you have an excuse anymore. No more of my dog ate my paper. I threw it out, whatever it is. Just save it digitally to the cloud. Keep everything. Employment verification letters, I think that's really important. So if you do a job on CPT or OPT, get a letter from them that just confirms dates of employment, job title, job duties. You may need it later on, and it may be tough to track it down later on. Second point, if you're not sure, ask somebody who knows, like an F or J advisor or an immigration attorney. Not Alexa or Siri or any of those people, and definitely not your best friend unless they're an immigration attorney. Next one is take advantage of your OPT. It is just really rare in immigration to have an unrestricted work permit. And what I mean by unrestricted is you can work anywhere you want. The only requirement is the job has to relate to your major. That's as easy as it gets. So really utilize that 1 year of OPT. The next 2 points are related. So as an F or J student, the worst thing you can do is work without authorization. If you're here as a J student and if you're here as an F, your job is to go to school. Being able to work is an added bonus, but don't take advantage of it. Be very careful and make sure you're not overstepping your bounds. And if you have questions, again, talk to somebody who knows. And then the final point is, the actions you take today may or may not have an impact tomorrow, next week, next month, or next year, but it could come back to harm you somewhere down the road. And I point this out because, you may do something and get away with it and think you're in the clear, but later on in life, if you apply for a green card or if you're outside the US applying for a visa, a lot of skeletons come up in those situations. And so things that you may have done in the past that you may have not even thought twice about or forgotten about, they could come back to harm you. So, for most of you, this is not a concern. Just follow the rules and do what you're supposed to be doing and stay in close contact with your F and J advisors for any assistance you need. All right, and then the last slide, I'm sure Ellen likes this one and is familiar with these questions, but when you apply for a job, unfortunately, you will often see these questions. These 2 questions have been approved by the federal government to be asked on job applications. And I hate these questions because it's not easy to answer, especially because they often only give you 2 choices to answer, yes or no. But for most of you, the answer is often maybe or I don't know. So my advice on this, answer as honestly and accurately as you can. And I think it's a good idea to supplement this with an email or a letter or a call to somebody at that company, maybe someone you know, a contact, HR, and explain your situation. You know, companies, and I know this from representing so many companies, they like honesty. They like people that are forthcoming about their status. They don't like surprises later on. So that's my advice on how to tackle those questions, but I know that they're a little stressful when you get to answering those. All right, I apologize that we went a little bit over. We had a lot to cover, and as you can tell, Sara and I really like talking about immigration. So I think at this point, we can move on to questions.
Great, okay. This is Ellen. I will leap in. Leah's been helping me flag questions. And I apologize to everybody because I know we won't get to all of your questions because you have so many great questions, which is wonderful. So one of the first things I really should ask both of you is, what do you want students to know about when to contact you and for what? There's lots of questions about in the chat about, can students contact you? How would they reach you? You know, what are some of the parameters that you want them to know?
Yes, so first off, could we move to the last slide, which has our, well, actually, I now see it doesn't have Sara's contact info, but it has mine. This is what I will tell you. If you have questions about your F or J status, you're welcome to contact us, but I will be honest with you, we will probably tell you the exact same thing that your advisor will tell you, except they will do it for free and we will charge you. So I don't think that's the best use of your time or resources. I think it's better to contact us, and by all means, feel free to reach out. If you're looking for help post-graduation, post-OPT, if you want to do, you know, an immigration kind of roadmap or strategy session, we do a lot of those for students that kind of want to plan ahead for the next couple years. But really, you know, what we should be contacted for is anything outside of the F and J context.
Great, perfect, thank you. So I'm going to dig into a few questions. So first thing is, how does someone maximize their chances of getting the H1B if they're only approved for 1 year and not STEM eligible?
Oh, okay. So they're saying if they only have the 1 year of OPT and don't have the 2-year extension, yeah, unfortunately, you know, you're not going to have as many chances most likely at the lottery. Now, do keep in mind, I mean, Sara mentioned before, you know, you don't win the lottery, but maybe you're working for a company that has offices overseas and you can go work there. And as a side note, I think in today's world, getting experience in different countries is incredibly important and will help you out in life later on. And then otherwise, you know, you can still be entered in the H-1B lottery if you're not in the US. So maybe the company really likes you and you have to stop working, you go home, but they enter you in the lottery anyway. And if you get it, you get an H-1B and you come back. So there are still some chances there. And otherwise, and Ellen, you would probably, you know, agree with me on this, that it's just really important to really build your network and make strong connections, because in today's world, you know, that's a lot of times where the jobs are going, is people that have made the effort to meet people at a company, you know, and showcase that there's somebody that's a good fit. And if it's somebody that the company really wants, they will often bend over backwards to make sure that they can hire you, which may mean entering you several times in the lottery.
And, you know, the kind of the unfortunate basics of the H-1B is that it really is a strict lottery. And, you know, yes, like Aaron mentioned, you get a slight advantage, you know, if you have a US advanced degree. But other than that, you're just kind of throwing your hat in with everybody else. So I think Aaron's advice is great. You know, you make sure you have that tight network and you're talking to a lot of people, because that's going to help you in the future, because it, you know, nothing is really going to help you in the strict lottery except luck.
Got it. Yeah, that's great advice. And for folks, feel free to reach out to Career Design, because we have some information to share that I think could be really helpful with this, especially around strategy and networking and possibly other things as well. For example, sometimes, and I think our attorneys would agree, many times students will take a position overseas and then end up back here.
Correct.
So, yeah, so be open. All right. Another question is can you enroll in a degree-seeking program while on an H1B? And could any employer sponsor for an H1B?
Yeah, you can enroll in a degree granting program. You do have to remember that when you're on an H1B, your primary role in the US is to work. Just like when you're on an F1, your primary role is to study. So yeah, you can do that. And then the second question was, can any employer sponsor? Was that the question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and any US employer can be a sponsor. You just have to show that they can pay you that prevailing wage salary or higher, and that there is an employer-employee relationship.
Great. Thank you. And there are also questions around if somebody's OPT period ends in January, but the H1B lottery happens in April, do they still have the chance to get the H1B, which I think is a great question.
Yeah, so let's walk through a hypothetical. Let's say it's November 16th. I'm sure you have a cohort of people graduating in December. Let's say you graduate in December, you get your OPT in January, and it expires so it starts January 2023, expires January 2024. Really what you want to do is get your employer to sponsor you for an H1B in March of 2023, which can be tough because you would have just started working for them, most likely, and you're going to need them to sponsor you. If they don't, and they wait until your OPT ends in January, what's going to happen is your OPT will end. 60 days later in March, you'll have to leave. They would still be able to enter you in the lottery. And then if it's approved, you'd be able to get your H1B visa and return on October 1st. So not ideal. Now, if you have the STEM extension and you graduate in December, it's a little less problematic because then at least you have 3 years and multiple chances while you're in the US.
Great, that's super helpful. And lots of questions about remote. Can somebody open up a business in one's country while working on an H1B? Can somebody work remotely while on an H1B, or even within the US, not near your workplace? So maybe that would be great.
Yeah, so I mean, remote work is definitely, I mean, all of our clients are doing it. Everyone's working remotely. So yeah, that's not a problem, as long as the H1B list that you're working remotely. So you just have to make sure that the H1B accurately, denotes where you're working. What was the first part of that question, Ellen?
Somebody was interested in, can one open up a business in one's home country while working on an H1B here? So in other words, can you do stuff in your home country while you're working here?
No, you can't. And that's a really good question. So the way that US immigration laws work is it's all based on physical presence, meaning all these laws are based on you being physically in the United States. And so you can't work in the United States unless you have a work visa. And it doesn't matter if your employer is in another country. It doesn't matter if they're paying you through a bank account in another country. And I get it. I get that you are just maybe sitting on your couch with a laptop working for a company in another country. It seems easy enough. And maybe in the future it will be permitted, but right now the immigration laws were really written before this was even contemplated. And so unless you have a work visa, you can't work in the US.
Okay. I know we were at 5:31 for our time. So I want to honor that. And I know that there were lots of questions in the chat. I might, if it's okay with you, I might connect with both of you after, just in case anything is there that's really easy to answer that you think would be.
Sure. Ellen, if you want, and if your dog permits, I'm happy. I can stay around for another 15 minutes if we want to do a few more questions, and then 5:45 would be my hard stop.
Got it. Okay. Megan, Leah, is that okay with you all? Feel free to let me know. It's actually not my dog, but I'm hard to hear dog. So yeah, I was like, okay.
It might be mine.
Okay.
That's too funny. Okay. So can an employer apply for an H-1B before someone graduates? That's another question that we've gotten.
Yeah, you can, assuming the person already has a degree. So for example, maybe they already have a bachelor's and they're working towards their master's. The employer can sponsor them, assuming they're sponsoring them in a position that only requires a bachelor's degree.
So I hope that answers that question. Lots of questions, Aaron and Sarah, about the H-1B from within a country. Like if somebody gets approved for the H-1B within the country versus getting approved for the H-1B overseas, like leaving, coming back, getting the visa stamp and travel. Do you have any, would you like to share your insight on that, either of you?
I mean, I would say that right now is one of the toughest times, although it's getting a little better, it's one of the toughest times to get a visa. And you all may not have seen this because all of the consulates and embassies prioritize F and J visas, but they don't prioritize H visas. And so we're seeing a lot of backlogs, and we're seeing people that it's taking months and even years to get a visa. And so given the situation right now, and this will get better, I know that, you are best off staying in the US and trying to process it in the US. And it's a tough thing to say because I know most people, they haven't traveled in a few years because of COVID, and now COVID is pretty much over. But now the problem is that there's not enough people working in the consulates to process visas. So we're really advising people, if they can avoid it, to try not to travel and apply for visas as long as possible, which is, I know, a tough thing to recommend.
No, it's really, really helpful. I think so, some of the questions are super specific, so I won't call those in especially, but just in general, I think that's really, really helpful. And then there are some questions about the H-1B versus the H-1B1, and I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, sure. So H1B1, as we've mentioned, is just for people who are nationals of Chile or Singapore. It does not have that fancy dual intent like the regular H1B does. So like I said before, it's not one where you would be disclosing to, a consular officer that you're going to be moving to the US forever. At the time of getting your visa, because you probably wouldn't get it. It's valid for 1 year. It's renewable indefinitely. It is similar to the H-1B is that you have to have an offer of employment with a U.S. company in a specialty occupation, so one that requires at least a bachelor's degree. You need a prevailing wage and an LCA, a labor condition application, which you also need for the H-1B that Aaron went over. But you can apply directly at a U.S. embassy or consulate for the H-1B1. But again, that's not something we're necessarily recommending at this time.
Okay, that's super. I know this is all very technical for everybody in the audience, and we are not educated as you are. So this is super helpful information.
Yeah, and I think just for that one, I mean, if you are someone who is a national of one of those places, I think the benefit of the H-1B1 versus the H-1B is that there is a cap on each of them, but we don't really meet it. So, like we always run into the cap for the regular H-1B and in the H-1B lottery, but for Chile or Singapore, you're probably not going to. So it could be a good option for you if you're from one of those countries and you don't want to kind of take your chances with the H-1B lottery, or you didn't make it into the H-1B lottery, to go for the H-1B1.
Thank you. Thank you very much for adding to that. And I think in general, it would be great to hear, what are some of the mistakes that you both have seen students make, employers make? What would be some good tips for students based on what your experience has been?
Oh, there's a lot. I mean, I'll start basic with just follow instructions. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we see people that, go to their F1 advisor to get endorsed for OPT, and then you have to file within 30 days and they file within 40 days and it gets rejected. So follow instructions. I think the advice I had at the end about knowing who to ask and who to contact and who to rely on, I think is really important. But Sarah, what else do you have, or do you think?
Please pull your I-94 from the CBP website and make sure it is accurate. And like Aaron said, for a lot of you on J's and F's, it's going to be duration of status, which is very helpful. But once you get into a different status that does have an ending validity date, you really need to make sure that that is accurate, because I've seen some really gnarly stuff in the past of people who, just, it was a mistake, and it's not your mistake, but if we don't catch it and we don't try to mitigate it in some way, it can really be a disaster down the road. So yeah, please check your I-94 always.
Good one. Yep.
Can you speak at all about, or would you be open to talking a little bit, anything regarding the Social Security Administration? We have, anything at all that you want to add around that?
Not really from me. We don't really get too involved. I would say probably your F and J advisors probably have more hands-on experience, because that's when a lot of students get their a lot of people get their Social Security number, is when they're working on CPT, OPT, or on-campus employment. Sarah, I don't know if you have any thoughts, but I feel like I rarely ever get involved with SSA issues.
Yeah, we really usually don't touch it until kind of the very end, when you're getting your green card, and you can get an unrestricted Social Security card at that point. But yeah, we usually don't touch it before then.
Okay, great. No, that's super helpful. There are some green card questions as well. And there are many, too many for me to even see, but things like, a question around, can one apply for the green card first before the H1B? I'm going to guess that you're going to, tell me, tell us.
Yeah. So that's a yes. And it's, I mentioned it as well, that it's not ideal. It's not recommended, but because we know that, like I said, 399,000 people were not going to get an H1B, we need to be creative and come up with other options. So we have a lot of people that we file for green cards that are not on an H1B. And for a lot of people, they just skip the H and go straight to a green card. So it depends. Everyone's case is different. There's some people where this just frankly will not work. And there's others where this is actually a pretty good option.
And there are some benefits to actually filing that green card application if you're eligible to. Say you want to do a national interest waiver case, and you have a pretty good case for it with the research that you're working on, and you want to file your adjustment of status application at the same time. While the adjustment of status application is pending, you will get a work authorization card. Now, in the good old days, you used to get that work authorization card, that EAD, within 90 days, very strictly, and now it's 8 months plus. So it's a long road, and so it's not a guarantee that you're not going to have kind of a break in work authorization if you're doing that, but there is a benefit to filing that adjustment application if you are eligible for it, because you will ultimately get that work authorization.
That's super helpful. With the diversity lottery, a student asked about, does that interfere if one applies for the diversity lottery? Does that count against them if they then apply for a different employment-based visa?
That's a great question, and no, it doesn't. And I think the better question actually is, does applying for the lottery show immigrant or green card intent that could cause an issue with your F1? And the answer is no. And so if you enter the lottery and then you go apply for a visa and it will ask you, have you ever filed for a green card? The answer based on that should be no, because all you did was enter a lottery. Now, if you are fortunate enough to be selected and win the lottery, that's when I would say you really should reach out to an immigration attorney and get some advice after you celebrate, because it's a great thing, but you want to be careful at that point. But if you just apply, you're completely fine. I hate to break it to you, but you're probably not going to win just because of the numbers, but definitely apply. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't cost anything, and it's not going to negatively impact your immigration status.
Wonderful, wonderful. Some great information here. I know we just have a couple of minutes, so I want to kind of just be sure to thank both of you. Thank you so much, Attorney Blumberg and Attorney Fleming. And I know the time went really fast. Thank you so much for staying a few minutes later. This was so informative, and I'm sure this is going to be very helpful to everybody moving forward. I also just wanted to thank a big thank you to Megan and Leah from OGS and the Office of General Counsel, Attorney Sandra Torres, and Attorney Laura Black, who's Assistant General Counsel here with us for this session. I want to remind people, because I've seen questions come up in the chat, that the recording is going to be available about 1 week from now on the OGS website. It's the first page at the bottom where recordings are posted, and you can reach out if you have trouble finding it. I'm happy to help, but it's that first page right at the bottom. So I just really want to thank everybody for being here. Thank our presenters. This is part of International Education Week, so we hope, I know I speak for Megan, Leah, and everybody, that we hope that you will attend additional programs this week for International Education Week, programs moving forward, and that, of course, I hope you'll utilize career design. So I want to conclude this program and just thank you again. This was really helpful, really informative.
Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely. Our pleasure. We really enjoyed it. And thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Take care. Thank you.